Kent Philpott, and this is program number 1 on the Gospel of Mark. Gospel of Mark, the first gospel written, and it is a short one. It's a little over 16 chapters, but it's going to take us more than 16 programs. Don't know how many, but we're going to get started. I love this Gospel of Mark, and we're going to be doing an introduction. Whenever you do a Bible book, there's always an introduction, and that's what this is going to be all about. Next week we'll start on verse 1, the first section of the gospel, but it's important to understand what a book is about often is to understand the background, the context, who wrote it, where was it written from, why was it written, what's going on, what are the dates, the times, the places, the people. So that's what really is involved in an introduction. So it is written by a fellow named Mark. Now that is not his Jewish name. His Jewish name is John. Mark is actually a Gentile name. And if you had talked to him, you called him, if you wanted to talk to him in Greek, it would be Marcus. If it had been Latin, it would be Marcus. So we have Mark, Marcos, and Marcus, but we'll be calling him Mark, which was a name that was came along a little bit later, again as a nickname, pretty much. We're going to look a little bit more into him. The gospel itself, in the document, there is no place where it says, this is Mark. It doesn't say, hi, Mark is my name, and I'm writing you this story about Jesus. It doesn't have it. And neither does Matthew, neither does Luke, and neither does John. But interestingly enough, we have a couple things going for us that help us to state who the writers are. And it is internal. The authors kind of reveal themselves in interesting little ways. And we're going to look at here in a little bit what is likely to be Mark's either advertent or inadvertent attempt to identify himself. So, the good tradition is that Mark wrote this book. His whole name would be John Mark. He was a companion of Paul and Barnabas on the first missionary journey, and he was very close to Peter, and that's going to play large in understanding the Gospel of Mark. Sometimes Mark is called the Gospel of Peter. The Gospel of Peter. Some will say that, Peter was dictating to Mark, and Mark was the scribe. That's hard to know, but very ancient tradition of some of the well-known church fathers indicate clearly that this gospel is named Mark because Mark is credited as the writer. We're going to get a little more into the identity of this man a little bit later. So he was a disciple of Peter, and in a way, toward the end and early on, he was a disciple of Paul and Barnabas. So he had all of these connections. And we're going to see that he grew up probably in Jerusalem and knew all of the apostles and knew Jesus as well. So, about 91% of the Gospel of Mark is found in Matthew and Luke. In Matthew and Luke. So what we're saying is that when Matthew wrote his gospel, he probably had Mark in front of him. When Luke wrote his gospel, he probably also had Mark in front of him as well. They built off of the Gospel of Mark. It seems pretty likely. Now, it's also possible that there was one or two other documents that Mark might have used to write his gospel. One of them is designated Q for the German word Quelle, 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 which means source. There seemed to be, scholars think, a written document that was behind Mark's gospel, the earliest written kind of a document telling the story of Jesus. This is uncertain, but scholars who analyze this stuff in great detail and over long decades have come up with the idea that there might be another source document that might have been available to Mark. A second document that may have been extant during Mark's time was a list of Old Testament prophecies that the Messiah, Jesus, had fulfilled. This becomes very evident in Matthew's Gospel, a listing of passages from the Old Testament prophets that were fulfilled in Jesus. And we're going to find next week, is it next week? I think pretty close to next week, that Mark may have had such a list as well, prophecies. So that much. And then we want to ask the question, when was the Gospel of Mark written? Now, we've already said that it is likely the first of the Gospels to be written. Now, we talked about the Gospels. When I'm talking about there, I'm talking about the Synoptic Gospels. They are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, not John. Anybody who's familiar with the New Testament knows that John is a lot different than Matthew, Mark, and Luke. We call these three Gospels the Synoptic Gospels, Synoptic, which means with, syn, the preposition from the Greek, with the same view. Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They seem very similar. When you, and I've done this a number of times in my ministry, I've gone through Matthew, Mark, and Luke, teaching them right straight through. And then when you do that, you'll notice significant differences amongst them, yet there is this similarity between them, so with the same view. And so Mark, thought to be the first. By the way, there was some years back, people who thought perhaps Matthew was the first gospel, but that idea has been pretty much discredited in more recent years. So the dating of Mark, the earliest date that I've been able to find goes back to about 48, AD 48, 49, up to about AD 52. AD 52. It just has that kind of attestation, I suppose. And it could be that Mark was the first of all of the Bible books to be written. Now, Paul's letter to the Galatians is often dated as early as AD 49. Now, the little book of James is an interesting book trying to date, and it may be in and around this time or earlier. It's very difficult, and we'll not take the time and bore you to death with all of the arguments for and against these various datings of these books. At least we know that Mark was the first gospel written, and so that is very interesting. And it was probably written about 15 or 16 years after the crucifixion, resurrection, and ascension of Jesus. So very close, very close. All the main players, all the disciples are yet living. And Mark would have had a great deal of interaction with these people. We'll see a little bit more about that a little bit here in the program. Where was the gospel written from? Likely while Peter was in Rome. Peter was in Rome early on. And so we people seem to think that Mark was accompanying Peter, and probably for missionary reasons began to write down the story of the life of Jesus. So that is what it's generally thought to be. And it has been dubbed the stumped-fingered, fingers, stump. And there's two ideas from that. That goes back to antiquity. Two ideas about that is that it is short. It has an abrupt ending. It actually ends with a preposition. Or it could have been actual that Mark had very short fingers, and we don't know. My own view is that it's because it's a short gospel compared to Matthew, Luke, and John. So we don't know. And it's going to be interesting when we get to chapter 16, and we're going to take a look at all the additions that have been made over the centuries to the Gospel of Mark. The only thing is, you can easily determine that they were added centuries later. And so that we know. And sometimes people will say, the Bible was tampered with. It was corrupted. I know that Muslim people have been taught that the Gospels, the Injil, were corrupted. Well, we know all of the corruptions, everything, down to almost the last little smidgen, and you can date them. You can determine their location, and all kinds of different things, because of the comparisons of some 5,000 manuscripts, some partial, some whole, of the Greek New Testament. So we'll have fun with that when we get to the last chapter of Mark. Now we're going to get into a little more of Bible study. We're going to take a little closer look at Mark and how it is that he may have identified himself. And for that, we're going to go to Mark chapter 14. Now, the story is, and by the way, we're going to be looking at verses 51 and 52. The story is that the Last Supper took place in the home of a wealthy woman by the name of Mary, and that Mark, or John, would have been a Jewish name, was the son of Mary, and that he was a teenager. And the disciples and Jesus met in that home. They celebrated the Passover. The institution of the Lord's Supper took place in that upper room, which would have been a large house. We're going to find out a little later that there was a servant woman in that house by the name of Rhoda. So you put those pieces together, and you see that it was likely a large house, and Mary was of some means. So here's what Mark 14, 51 and 52 says. And a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth about his body, and they seized him. Now, he follows the disciples into the Garden of Gethsemane at the conclusion of the Passover Seder and the Lord's Supper. He heard them. Now, the linen cloth, that would have been like pajamas back in those days. And here the young man was likely woken by the noise of the people going out. Remember, they went out singing a hymn. He woke up and he followed them. He followed them into Gethsemane. That's what's being depicted here. Very interesting. So he just got his nightshirt on, whatever. And they seized him, but he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. Now, here it is, probably a barefoot kid, and he's fast. And these guys with all of their equipment, they couldn't keep up with this kid. And he skedaddled. And so he kind of Mark writes himself into this. It appears no place else. And it's kind of a way that some writers have of insinuating themselves into the story, providing little clues as to who it might be referring to. So, okay. So we've got that much. Now we first meet Mark in Acts chapter 12. Acts chapter 12, verses 12 to 17. Okay. Now this is the story of when Peter miraculously is delivered from prison. Remember, he was ordered not to talk about Jesus, not to mention it, and he says, well, to obey you or God, I'm going to obey God. And so, anyway, Peter was miraculously delivered from prison. So where does he go? He goes to the house of Mary. He goes to Mary's house, where the Lord's Supper had taken place. So he goes there, and he knocks on the door, but he runs into a little trouble. So here's what it says in verse 12. When he realized this, that Peter was free, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, whose other name was Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. Now this is Luke writing. This is not Mark. This is Luke. And so this is where we get the name John Mark from here. So Mary is his mother. Peter goes to this house. Verse 13, and when he knocked at the door of the gateway. Now this is a gated place. He had to get through the gate. Another indication of a wealthy household. And when he knocked at the door of the gateway, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. Now, a servant, this is a word that means like a hired servant. She wasn't a slave. She was hired to do this work. And so she came, and recognizing Peter's voice, in her joy she did not open the gate, but ran in and reported that Peter was standing at the gate. So this Rhoda was a part of the household. Peter obviously was frequently there because Rhoda recognized his voice. This is where the disciples and Jesus spent a lot of time when they visited Jerusalem. So we have, again, this where we find, where we first meet Mark, John Mark, and at his mother's house in Jerusalem. Now, the next time we find him is in Acts chapter 13 and verse 5. Acts 13:5. Now, this is the story of Barnabas and Saul, or Paul. So they were set off by the church at Antioch on a missionary journey. It was Barnabas and Saul, or Paul, and Mark was with them. Now here's what we find in verse 5. When they arrived at Salamis, they proclaimed the word of God in the synagogues of the Jews, and they had John to assist them. So that's all I want to talk about at that particular point. The issue is that they had John with them. And so here he is. This young man, John Mark, is with the great apostle Paul, but he's also with Barnabas. And later on we're going to find out that Barnabas is actually a cousin of John Mark. Well, I'm going to get to that it's got a little twist to it that some people may not be utterly happy with, but there's going to be a little twist along the way. So John is assisting Barnabas and Paul. Now, we're going to find him a little bit later in the same chapter in verse 13. Paul and Barnabas, now they're in Antioch of Pisidia. They're on their way on the first missionary journey. Verse 13 says, now Paul and his companions set sail from Paphos, which by the way is in Cyprus, and was where Barnabas was from. And they came to Perga in Pamphylia, and John left them and returned to Jerusalem. Okay, now this is said just very quickly in passing. Boom, here it is. John left them. Now, we're not told why he left them, what the issue was. There's no indication that there was an argument, that John Mark was injured in any way. We don't know. We don't know what happened. But what the Scripture, what Luke clearly points out, that midstream in the work of missionary work, Mark left and went home. Now, the next time we find Mark is in chapter 15. Chapter 15 and verses 36 to 41. So, now the first missionary journey has been concluded. Paul and Barnabas have returned home. They would have gone to the church at Antioch, the church that sent them out. And now they're going to get going on another one. So here we pick up the story in Acts 15, beginning at verse 36. After some days, Paul said to Barnabas, we don't know how long they rested, let us return and visit the brothers in every city where we proclaim the word of the Lord and see how they are. Oh, it's interesting, you look into the heart of Paul here just a little bit, and he's concerned about these people. Paul was a missionary, he was an apostle, but he was also had a pastor's heart. He wanted to return and see how the people were doing. That's his intention, and he wants Barnabas to come with him, obviously. Verse 37, now Barnabas wanted to take with them John called Mark. But Paul thought best not to take with them one who had withdrawn them from Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. I love that little phrase, not gone with them to the work. That's how they viewed it. It was a work. It was what Christians are to set themselves about. There's no retirement in Christianity, we like to say. The work is always in front of us. And it doesn't make any difference if you're young, strong, robust, full-bodied, whatever, or if you're old and decrepit, blind, deaf, and dumb. It doesn't matter. The work never stops. You know, maybe all that is left is the opportunity for prayer. Maybe that's all. But that's still work, and it's of value. So, to the work. I just love that idea of to the work. Anyway, so verse 39 says, and there arose a sharp disagreement so that they separated from each other. The first church split. What do you know? There it is. This kind of thing happens in Christianity. God always uses it for good. I mean, here's a bunch of sinners put together in one place, one group. There's going to be problems. There's going to be trouble. We are sinful human beings. We got all kinds of different things going on that are motivating us, and some of it is not so good. They separated. Paul refused to agree to take Mark. We don't know if there's anything else behind it or not. We don't know. So Barnabas took Mark with him and sailed away to Cyprus. They'd been there. Barnabas said, I'm going to go back and check on the folks at Cyprus. But Paul chose Silas and departed, having been commended by the brothers to the grace of the Lord, and he went through Syria and Cilicia, strengthening the churches. So Paul goes about doing exactly what he said he wanted to do. Okay, so we've done that. We've gotten to talk about the split up between the two. And we're going to look now at 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 13. I want to quote this, which points out that at some point, Mark and Peter had joined together. Here's what 1 Peter 5:13 says. She who is at Babylon, who is likewise chosen, sends you greetings, and so does Mark, my son. Now this is writing from Rome, of course, Babylon, Rome. And the people to whom Peter sends his letter says, and so does Mark, my son. So Peter, we don't know if he had any children, but we know he was married. maybe had kind of taken Mark under his wing, and maybe the reason that why we have the Gospel of Mark in the first place. Now, two more verses we're going to look at, and they're quite interesting in that we find that there was a healing between Paul and Mark. There was a problem, but there was a reconciliation. So we'll look at that just in closing here. In Colossians chapter 4, verse 10, it says, Paul writes to the church at Colossae, Aristarchus, my fellow prisoner, greets you, and Mark, the cousin of Barnabas, concerning whom you have received instructions. If he comes to you, welcome him. And Jesus, who was called Justus. So here we have Paul, who is writing now while in prison, and he writes and says, welcome Mark. Mark is active in ministry. He's doing the work. And he may come to them, and Paul says, welcome him, welcome him. One other place we find this in 2 Timothy chapter 4, verse 11. 4:11. Here's what Paul writes to Timothy. Luke alone is with me. This is just before Paul is going to be martyred. Luke alone is with me. Get Mark and bring him with you, for he is very useful to me for ministry. So you see, though there had been a disruption of fellowship, here was the reconciliation, and you see how valuable Mark was to Paul. So this is a rough sketch. Mark, it is said, traditionally died as a martyr. It is thought that he founded a church in Alexandria, Egypt, and was a bishop over a rather large area. But what you really kind of get about Mark, he wasn't the kind of leader that Paul, Barnabas, and some of the others were, the other apostles. But what he was he was a trusted and competent follower. After all, he gave us the first gospel. He may have vacillated earlier, but that's only a snapshot in time. Some people will see what somebody did and they'll say, oh, they're no good. Peter didn't give up on him. Barnabas didn't give up on him. Paul didn't give up on him. God didn't give up on him. He later became of extreme use in the early proclamation of the gospel. And it's sort of like Jeremiah. You study him, you find out, you go about serving the Lord, you're going to have some powerful enemies. And so Mark had, but he came through and has given us a great deal. So long.